Okay, I'm going to start this over. This is chapter 6 of The Fifth Sacred Thing. A black crow became Bird's guide. He would see it fly before them to reveal a way across a ravine, or hear it call, beckoning them down to a certain path at a crossroads. He and Little John followed trails and overgrown dirt roads and fire roads, sometimes emerging into a stretch of broken pavement buckled by tree roots, sometimes losing any semblance of trail and crawling on their hands and knees through the underbrush. The crow led them through the dunes that bordered the hill country and flapped down in an abandoned garden by a flat, marshy lake where they were able to gather grapes and self-seeded tomatoes. They were still hungry, but they would survive. Walking on the sand of the dunes strained Bird's sore muscles, but he pushed on. At times, they could follow a trail over bluffs that looked out on water. Bird had tried, in the hills, to steer away from the sprawling vines of poison oak, but by the third day he was itching and miserable. It never affected me before, Bird complained. I used to be able to roll in this stuff and it never bothered me. Piss on it, Little John said. That'll take away the itching. Are you sure? Anyway, it'll help. Can't you heal it? I'm doing my best, but I'm not really a healer. When there's a life and death situation, sometimes something comes over me, but it seems to have deserted me now. If Sandy were here, he'd have an herb for the itch, and Madrone, she can make you feel better with a wave of her hand. Who are they? My family, my lovers, if they're still alive. They were silent. The long rush and hiss of waves reached them where they sat, concealed under the sheltering branches of live oak. What's going to happen when we get to your home? Little John asked suddenly. You'll be welcome there. Yeah, we'll see. I mean it. Sure, your family's going to be real happy to see you come home dragging some faggot you picked up in the pit. Little John, when I say my family, I mean all my lovers and all their lovers and kids and ex-lovers and everyone, and half of them are faggots, at least half the time. We consider it a word to be proud of. They're going to welcome competition? We don't see it like that. Sure you don't. I'm not saying nobody ever gets jealous, but we work it out. Yeah, sure. Look, Charlie, what we done in the pit don't necessarily carry over outside. I understand that. Sure you don't. I'm not saying nobody ever gets... Wait, hold on. Let's see. Sure. Where did I mess up? Yeah, sure. Look, Charlie, what we've done in the pit don't necessarily carry over outside. I understand that. I don't. We come from different worlds. You're a real witch. You got powers. Me, the only thing I really know about magic is it makes you fair game for any demon fucker who wants to take it into his head to kill you. When you get back with your own kind, you won't want to hang around with me. I'll teach you, Bird said. We'll all teach you. But he was trying to convince himself, because he suspected maybe Little John was right. Their bodies joined, but barriers remained that Bird couldn't cross and maybe feared to. Little John was opaque to him. Hell, Charlie, when you get to know me outside the joint, you won't even like me. Don't say that. It's the truth. Some part of Little John had already passed judgment on himself, or had accepted the judgment of a world that never really wanted him anything but dead, or as something to use and throw away, a rag to wipe a dripping cock with. Bird wanted to do battle with that thing, Little John's demon, but he couldn't say the words of challenge or reassurance because he did not know if they were true. He didn't know Little John, not really, not down in the soul where it counted, and he ached for people he did know, who opened at his touch and shared the same ground. Well, there's not much point in worrying about it, Bird said finally. We may never get to my home, and there may be nobody still alive if we do. Yeah, there's always that possibility, Little John said, but somehow I think you'll find your people. Thanks. If they're anything like you, they'll be damn hard to kill. They slept curled up together against the cold, burrowed into the roots of the trees. Bird cast a circle of protection around them and set wards. Going through the forms of the ritual, although he didn't feel much power. But power follows practice, Maya always said. The more he used his magic, the stronger it would become. In his dream that night, he became a hawk, soaring over the hills to the north. The hills were green, as if were early spring after a wet winter. In a blue cove squatted a domed structure, the old nuclear power plant that had been refurbished in the early 20s. Bird could see its energy field, like a living thing, and small sparks within it that were sprints of men who operated it. One by one, the sparks winked out, the dome began to glow, and the grass and the trees began to die. He woke shivering and sweating. He had had that dream before. When? "What's wrong?" Little John asked. "Just a dream, an old dream, nothing." "You're shaking." "I think it's part of what I can still remember. How I got down here in the first place, what I did." "Don't worry about it," Little John said. "We're getting out. That's enough to occupy your mind." As they made their way further north, Bird got more and more nervous. They would soon reach the place where the coastline curved eastward to meet the convergence of the old coast road and the inland highway. The road ran right along the beach for nearly 10 miles. High John had warned them, with no cover. He could feel the road closing in on them, trapping them in a narrow cul-de-sac. If they were being hunted, they were approaching the perfect spot for an ambush, but the crow urged them on. As dusk fell, Bird could make out a silver line of fencing. He felt the aura of an electronic barrier. "Let's stop," he said. They waited for nightfall. The fenced-in land ahead of them was posted with military signs. Where the road curved to the edge of the coast and the fence began was a gate and a checkpoint where armed guards patrolled. Maybe he could kill the electricity long enough for them to get over the fence. But that might alert the guards to their presence, and they would still have miles to go on a road with little cover, or more vehicles than he ever remembered seeing at one time sped up and down, headlights glaring. Bird looked thoughtfully at the water, where searchlights played at regular intervals. He grimaced. It could be contaminated with anything from sewage to radiation. But what choice did they have? "Can you swim?" he asked Little John. "No, sorry." Bird considered. The fence ran down to the water, but he didn't know how far into the water it ran. He stripped off his clothes. "Wait here," he said. A searchlight played on the front of the fence, but he tried it and ran out during its shadow, hitting the ground and rolling when the light returned. He crawled along the edge of the fence and lowered himself into the water. It was bone-numbing cold. The waves sucked at his legs, trying to pull him under, but the fence ended before he got out of his depth. They could do it, barely. Cautiously, he made his way back to Little John, had him take off his clothes and follow. Bird rolled their clothes up into a tight bundle and balanced it on his head, and he led Little John into the waves. For one awful moment, the searchlights caught them. They froze, kneeling down in the frigid water, listening for shouts. But the light passed and no one came after them. They crawled out on the other side. The barrier at the highway's edge formed a line of shadow just deep enough for them to lie in, side by side, huddling together to restore some warmth to their cold bodies. Bird's plan was to move in that shadow, crawling if necessary, running when the searchlights let them. A thick bank of fog covered the sky, offering some concealment, even though the moon was nearly full, shedding a diffused, pearly light. They couldn't wait for moonset, which wouldn't come until nearly dawn. They needed to hurry. They had to be off the base or well hidden by daylight. So he urged Little John to put on his pants and ragged shirt, and they set off. If they stayed on their hands and knees, the searchlights and headlights passed over them. During the dark periods, they could run for it, throwing themselves down on the ground when the light returned. It was a hard way to travel. Bird thought about pilgrims crawling to sacred places for penitence. His knees were soon bleeding and his hands scraped, but they had no choice except to go on. After several hours, Bird began to wonder how long he could continue to force his body to move. He had no idea how much ground they had covered. 8 miles? 9? The eastern sky began to glow with a dim gray light, and the stars were disappearing. He urged Little John on. He thought he could see another line of fence ahead of them, maybe a mile away, where the road curved inland and the coastal hills bulged out to the west. They could find cover there, if they were over the fence before daylight came. Gray turned to pink, and the black faded to blue. They were making good time, but not good enough. "Let's run for it," he said to Little John, who nodded. They abandoned their cautious crawl and ran flat out. Bird felt his body obeyed him only because he refused to consider the possibility that it wouldn't. There was no real strength or speed left in him, but somehow they made it to the fence. It was marked with a skull and crossbones and a sign warning, "Toxic territory." Whatever lay on the other side couldn't be nearly as toxic as the road would be to them in a few minutes. Bird laid his hand on the fence and sent an energy spark to cut the electricity. It no longer mattered if they alerted the guards. As long as they got over the fence, they could hide in the thick brush across the way. Little John climbed quickly to the top, and Bird moved to follow. He made it up a few feet, and then his bad leg froze. His muscles refused to work. Bird was stuck halfway up, sweating. Little John looked back and saw him. "Come on," he whispered. "Go on," Bird said. "I can't make it over." Little John turned, climbed back over the fence, grabbed Bird, and hoisted him over the top. They fell down together on the ground, landing heavily, with breath knocked out of them. After a moment, Bird felt himself. He was bruised, but nothing was broken. "You okay?" he asked Little John. "Yeah, thanks. Let's get out of here." Only a small side road separated them from the new range of hills. They were soon across it and into the underbrush. They made it another mile from the gate before Bird's body finally gave out. He had just enough strength to crawl into the shelter of the grove of oaks and draw a magic circle around them. Then he collapsed. The sun shone down through the leaves, dried their clothes, and warmed their bodies, but they were unaware. They slept. The day passed and the sun passed, drawing a line of shadow in its wake. Bird felt the chill in his sleep, stirred and opened his eyes. Little John was still asleep. Bird wanted to get up, but his muscles were too stiff, and he found he could only roll over very slowly and push himself up with his arms into his kneeling position. As he raised his head, he found himself staring into the barrel of an ancient shotgun. For one moment, everything he could see seemed sharply outlined in light. A leaf, a branch, a patch of ground were imprinted on his retinas. Last images to take with him into the spirit world. He knew he couldn't run. He must have pulled every muscle in his back and hips, and his neck was so sore he could only continue to raise his head very slowly. If he couldn't run, he would have to die. It was as simple as that. He would never go back to imprisonment. But as his eyes traveled up the barrel of the gun, he became aware that he was not facing a guard. The hands on the gun were brown, cracked, and dirty, with broken nails, but undeniably female. The arms connected to the body that had breasts under a ragged cotton shirt, and the face, but when he reached the face, he froze again. This face was like nothing he'd ever seen before. At first, it seemed to be one gaping hole. Then he discerned a lower lip, capped by an upper lip, split into two around an open gash where a nose should have been. The face was framed in wild, uncombed dreadlocks, and the eyes. But the eyes caught him. They were brown, wide-set under well-shaped brows, and he looked at them, he fell into their depths. He didn't look into the eyes like that for years, but now he could stare lingeringly at eyes that opened to him and entered into him, that he read exactly what he was thinking and feeling, that remained steady under his first shock. He wondered what it was like to live behind that face with those knowing eyes. They would never misread revulsion or rejection, but what he felt in their depths was compassion. "Who's our mother?" a man's voice said behind him. He pushed himself up to his feet and turned. No one was there. Am I hearing things now? He wondered, but then he looked down at a pistol trained on him, held by a man who ended at his hips. He was muscularly built and handsome, with round blue eyes and a thick, curling black beard covering most of his oak-brown face, but where his legs should be, Bird saw nothing, as if his trunk had sprung up out of the ground. "Who's our mother?" the man said again. Maybe this was an after effect of the drugs they'd been given. Little John began to stir, and Bird remembered suddenly his first meeting with High John. The earth is our mother," Bird said. "We must take care of her," came a voice from off to the left. Little John looked up. They were surrounded by a ring of armed figures, some with faces oddly distorted, others missing a hand or an arm or some withered limb dangling. Bird counted 7 of them. "Who are you?" The first woman spoke. Her voice was as thick as somewhat distorted, but it rang with a tone of confidence and authority. Bird turned to her again. He realized, looking again into those eyes, that he couldn't lie to her. She was reading him as well as any witch might. "My name is Bird," he said. "Bird Lavender Black Dragon." His own name tasted sweet over his tongue and unfamiliar. It had been so many years since he spoke it aloud. He felt something from Little John, a small spark of hurt, and he realized he never told him his real name. There was no help for that now. "This is Little John." We've escaped from the south, from a work crew, but I come from the north, from the city." There was an excited murmur around them. The woman said something that Bird couldn't quite understand. The legless man repeated it more clearly. "You are witches." "Right, from the north." "He is," Little John said. "Are you being tracked?" "No," Bird said. "Hell," Little John added, "if we're being tracked, we wouldn't be here. We'd be dead. Say, don't you think you could put those guns down?" "We're fairly harmless, really," Bird said. The woman's eyes held his, searching. She reminded him of Maya. He felt known to the core and, after a moment, accepted. "Not harmless," she said, "but I will trust you." Another murmur, and the guns were lowered. The woman stepped forward and held out her hands to Bird. He reached out, and she clasped his hands between hers warmly. "Welcome," she said, and pointed to her own breast. "I am Rhea." Bird felt her touch go through him like an electric shock. Suddenly he wanted to be taken into those arms, enfolded in that touch, to fall into the wells of those eyes. He felt the possibility in her of contact, and the need for it possessed him more strongly than hunger. The man with no legs tucked the gun into his belt. He came forward, moving gracefully by balancing on his palms and swinging his torso between his arms. "I'm Morton," he said. "Welcome to the dancing ground of the monsters." "Monsters?" Little John asked. Morton grinned. "That's us. Fits, don't you think?" "They can't possibly answer that and be both honest and polite," a slender young woman said. Her long black hair was arranged in a mass of tiny braids that framed cat-like triangular face. Her left hand was shaped like a claw. "I'm Dana. Welcome." "But who are you?" Bird asked. "And what are you doing here?" "We live here," Rhea said. "Isn't the land poisoned?" "Look us over closely," Morton said. "We're all natives of Slowtown and the Irish Hills, all born back when the old reactor was still running, probably leaking like crazy, but what the hell did they care?" Of course, you don't see the ones who died of cancer. And you still live here? Little John asked. We got to live somewhere, Dana said. It's livable, Morton said. For us, yeah, there's probably still some radiation. It don't go away, but it's better now than it was 10 years ago. In the big epidemic, the witches from the north sent down a raiding party, shut the thing down, smashed the controls, died doing it too. Goddess, give them peace, Dana murmured. My back hurts. Let's see. Do it like that. Ouch. Above their heads, a crow called. A shell broke open somewhere in Bird's spine, sending shivers of energy climbing to the top of his head. A jumble of images flashed his mind. Long white corridors and a round pit of a room lined the dials and switches. And most of all, the presence like a living thing with its own strange beauty, matter liberating itself into power, a presence that did not want to die, but he had killed it. It's been better since then, Morton went on. The millennialists had purged so many techies that the stewards didn't have to know how left to repair the reactor or start it up again. The land feels better now, and there's been some kids born that are okay. Not to us, but there's some others in the town, deserters from the army. We work to heal the land, Rhea said, on the moons and the festivals. Bird barely heard what she said. He remembered the cold feel of a gun in his hand, an old-fashioned revolver Tom had brought them from the forest communities. And if he followed the aim of the gun, he saw a doe-white face slimed with fear and a pasty hand pulling switch after switch to move control rods in between fuel rods in a patterned sequence, shutting the reactors down. It had taken a long, long time. They had spelled each other, he and Cleese, Zora, and Tom, holding the guns, forcing the man to do their will, standing guard. We like to mean the idea that this place is too toxic to deal with, Morton said. Keeps away unwanted interference. When necessary, we make enough of an appearance to keep rumors current, Dana said. Someone had come at him, another man, freckled and sandy-haired, and shouting something. Bird's hand had jerked, and the bullet caught the man between the eyes, sending his spirit shrieking off in shock and outrage, and his body crashing at Bird's feet at the nuclear hum, grew faint as a whining dog. Yes, he remembered feeling the man die, looking down at his face, as he had looked down at his father's face after the uprising. Maybe all the dead look the same. How long have you lived here? Little John was asking, glancing curiously at Bird's remote eyes. Since the hunger came, Dana said. Most of us were kids then. We lived in our families in Slowtown and the state school. When food got short, they threw us out. When the last switch was pulled and the hum silenced, they emptied their guns into the control panel, which had left them unarmed and helpless. When the door exploded and the guards came in firing, Zora had screamed. Cleese moaned and fell as Tom cried out, and then they became the birds, soaring away on the updraft. Something had hit Bird in the thigh. He remembered, falling in a blaze of pain, and then nothing. You okay, Little John? Asked. Bird nodded and tried to focus on Morton, who was going on with his story. There was a woman lived at Avila Beach. We called it Avalon Beach now, Morton said. She took us in, taught us some things about growing food, herbs. She had certain herbs she said would cure cancer, so she wasn't afraid of the land. She was a good woman. The millennialists took her away in 35, Dana said. Goddess, give her peace, the others murmured around the circle. They came forward and introduced themselves. Gardner, a small dwarf-like man, Anna, a woman with no left arm, and Holly and Heather, twin sisters with humped backs. Bird's head spun with names and memories. Ground, he told himself, stay in the present, now. A secret seed of pride stirred in his gut. These were his people, although they didn't know it. He had given them their lives. He had committed once one act that changed the world. Are you here? He called silently to Cleese, Sora, and Tom. Do you know that your lives bought something after all? Why can't I feel you? The air had grown cold and the sky darkened, but he shivered. This is our ritual circle, Rhea said. We were just about to set up for the full moon ritual when we stumbled on you two. Will you join us? We don't often get to celebrate with witches from other places. We'd be honored, Bird said. The monsters began busily building a fire in the pit in the center of the clearing. Behind the trees, the sun was setting in a red glow. The air grew cool as the sky turned from blue to indigo. Someone threw a blanket over Bird's shoulders and he clutched it gratefully. Light winked behind the branches of the oaks in the east, and slowly a full moon rose to paint the dry grasses silver. They crowded around the fire. Bird felt the warmth on his hands and drew it into his body. He hadn't eaten in so long he was almost beyond hunger. Light-headed, beginning to lose sight of the forms of the things and recognize only the energies. His leg ached. Yes, he'd been shot there, and it had never healed right. And there was just one of the reasons he hurt. The fire felt good, but he wondered how long he could continue to stand erect. The monsters set up an altar on a flat rock in the north. Dana lit a candle in a glass jar, and the others brought out food from their baskets and placed it around the altar, setting out loaves of bread, slabs of cheese, bowls of apples and grapes, and steaming pots of stew. Bird swallowed. His throat was dry, and now hunger stabbed at him. Little John was staring at the food. Rhea came over and placed a hunk of bread in Bird's hands. Eat, she said, you're hungry. Bird didn't deny it. His hands trembled as he tore off a small corner of the bread and threw it into the fire as an offering. Reverently, he bit into the bread and began to chew. Saliva sprang painfully into his cheeks, and he forced himself to chew slowly, not to tear at the bread like a ravenous animal. Little John was sitting on the ground making whimpering sounds as he gulped down his portion. When Rhea saw how hungry the two men were, she and Dana brought them bowls of stew and more bread, and sweet apple juice to wash the food down. Before long, Bird realized he didn't need to control himself or he would be sick. He did need to control himself or he'd be sick. Take it easy, he said to Little John. If we eat too much now, we'll regret it. You can feast more later, Rhea said. Bird found himself more and more able to understand her speech as his sense of contact deepened. Now it's time to begin the ritual. They stood in a circle around the fire. Morton turned to Little John. Will you ground us? He asked. Little John looked alarmed. I don't know anything, he said. You ask him. He jerked his head in Bird's direction. He's a real witch from the north. He's got real powers. We don't have too much in the way of powers, Morton said. They killed our teachers when we were just getting started. But we've got books. Will you ground us? Rhea asked Bird. I don't feel very grounded, he said. Someone else ground us, and I'll cast the circle. The small woman who lacked an arm stepped forward. Bird had forgotten her name. She picked up a book from behind the altar, opened it, and began reading. The words sounded oddly familiar to Bird, but it took him a while to place them. With a shock, he realized what they were. An exercise out of one of Maya's early books, the one they used to amuse themselves with as children, giggling over what they considered to be simple-minded instructions, teasing Maya until she would finally turn on them and chase them out. You brats don't know how lucky you are, she'd yell at them. Do you know what it's like to be raised with your whole life not to feel, not to trust your intuition, not to notice if you see an aura or feel energy move, and then try to turn around as an adult and try to learn it all? You put that book down. Now he realized that the woman was simply reading the directions for grounding somewhat expressionlessly. With a breath, he grounded himself, sending roots of energy down through his feet into the earth, making contacts with the earth's core of fire and drawing the moon's light. The reading ended. Everyone in the circle looked serious, even solemn, but he didn't see that their energy had significantly changed. Will you cast the circle now? Rhea said. He walked to the altar, still moving slowly and painfully, and considered the tools. They lay in their proper positions. In the east, the knife, the athame, tool of air, symbol of the mind's power to make divisions and separations. In the south, the wand, tool of fire, symbol of energy and the power to channel and direct it. In the west, a clay cup holding the water that represented emotion, fertility, love. And in the north, 5-pointed pentacle carved on a stone slab, symbol of earth, of the body, the 5 senses, 5 fingers and toes, 4 elements, the 4 sacred things, linked with the 5th, spirit. Can I use this athame? He asked. It's mine, Morton said. Go ahead. Bird picked it up and held it for a moment, feeling its power and something of Morton in it. Stubborn strength, determination to survive. He walked out to the center and stood by the fire. Taking a deep breath, he let his own energy extend out to include the whole circle, to link with their willingness and intention to come together. When he felt the energy of the circle become one whole, he grounded it, sending it down through his own body into the earth, then drawing it back up again. He looked around. Good. The patterns had changed, and as he'd hoped, and they were all connected to the earth. Starting in the north, he walked around the circle, using the knife to draw around them in the air a ring of protection that sprang up as a flickering blue flame. At each of the 4 quarters, he drew a pentacle. Behind him, he heard a murmur of surprise, as they'd never seen the circle manifest. Maybe they hadn't, he reflected, as he returned the knife to the altar. By the earth that is her body, and by the air that is her breath, and by the fire of her spirit, and by the living waters of her womb, the circle is cast, he said. They called the 4 directions, the elements of the quarters. Again, by reading out of a book. People kept casting little glances toward him as if to say, is this right? Are we really doing it right? He controlled his expression, but invoked secretly himself, sending his own energy out into the elemental realms to contact air, earth, fire, water. It had been a long, long time since he had stood in circle with others, and there was something touching about those halting, awkward attempts to keep the rights without really understanding how to raise and channel the power. Then several people picked up drums and began to beat a simple rhythm and sing old chant that he recognized. Silver shining wheel of radiance, radiance, mother come to us. They were calling the moon, the goddess of her aspect as abundant one, the mother, she who sustains life. And Bird threw up his arms and thanked her, remembering his prayers in the prison and feeling the tears flow down his face as he felt the light shine. They had survived and they were free. Someone handed him a drum, a carved wooden cylinder with a skin head. He held it to the fire until the head tightened from the warmth and then began to play. His hands were stiff and they hurt, but as the rhythm built, he grew numb to the pain. Only some of the other drummers were in time to the rhythm of the chant. The others wandered vaguely in and out, hitting the rhythm sometimes and missing it more often. He began with a strong, solid beat to bring them all into alignment, and then let himself play with it, adding syncopation and counter rhythms. The guitar had been his instrument, not the drum, but like every child of the city, he learned to drum before he learned to count, adding and subtracting and dividing by changing beats before he was ever introduced to numbers. Where am I? Now he made the beat come alive, even as his battered hands kept him to simpler patterns and prevented him from trying to fast runs and rolls. Rhythm was old as the rhythm of the moon, swelling to full and waning to dark. His hands told him he would never make music again the way he had before, on guitar or piano. What he heard in his heart would remain locked there because his fingers were no longer capable of evoking its power. He was broken, like the strange, wounded company that surrounded him with their broken beat. Maybe this was all that was left, this maimed circle on the edge of a poisoned world. Maybe he had no more home, no family. Maybe there was no more circles of powerful witches who knew how to tell energy from form. Maybe there were no rings of sweet lovers waiting to welcome him back. No ancient crones who could talk with the spirits. No one still willing to fight for the survival of the earth. No one left even to remember the dead. The chant peaked and died. The goddess is here, Rhea said. What chant shall we sing for the god? I've got one, Bird said. He began a new beat on the drum and sang a calling chant, hearing the rough voices around him pick it up, and he visualized the stag he'd seen on the hill, and the sun between its antlers, and the sun that this season was declining so the long nights could come, wounding itself to allow to the rain to return. He sang until he could almost feel antlers sprout out on his own head. Life to life gives itself away, day to night and night to day. He is here, Rhea said. They danced around the fire, making offerings, singing chants of healing and change. Bird pulled healing power down from the moon and spun it into the cone that could rise like a fountain and spill itself out over the land. After the energy had been grounded, they sat silent, looking into the fire, listening to its messages. Couples began to steal away together, out of the circle, cutting through its fire and stealing it behind them. Bird lay on the earth behind the fire, letting the warmth ease his sore muscles, drawing its energy to heal the breaks in his cells. He felt a hand on his shoulder. Turning, he looked into Rhea's eyes. "Will you make the great right with me?" She asked. He felt it again, the desire, the pull of energy to energy. But he hesitated, casting a glance around the circle for Little John. He didn't want to hurt him. But Little John seemed to have disappeared. Maybe he too had found somebody. Rhea's eyes were on him, waiting. Her hand on his shoulder was warm, smoldering. This isn't safe, he thought, even if his exhausted body still had strength left to rise. But it felt right. The power of the god still burned in him. His veins carried liquid fire. He could withhold nothing from this people, his people. Leah led him outside the circle into a small sheltered spot under the branches of a live oak where she spread a blanket out for them. Bird looked into Rhea's eyes. They were old and dark and luminous. Her face changed, no longer seeming grotesque, but absolutely right. A mirror for the damaged land, like the face survived to harbor the possibility of growth and change. Her body against his hands felt like soft loam, and she lowered herself into him, and he was the sun come down to the earth at last. He opened to her fully and gave himself over to the power she harbored within her, as she opened to him, revealing pain and beauty that answered his own pain. She was broken, he was broken, and this land was broken. But thanks to him and to the others who had suffered and died for it, not destroyed. She was the bitter brew that nonetheless healed, like one of Sandy's mixtures, the homeopathic drop of poison that cured, the tainted land that still fed life. He brought the sun to her, the dying, weakening, wounded sun that consumes itself as it gives light. As he had brought to the land his own life-sustaining willingness to give himself away. And so he received back the bittersweet gift of the land, and reigned. The sound of the distant waves woke Bird in the morning. His bed was a pallet on a wood floor covered with old blankets. Sun poured through the window when he turned his head. He could glimpse the ocean. He yawned and stretched, feeling surprisingly good. Or maybe not surprisingly. He had much to feel good about. His body had been fed in every way, and he could reasonably look forward to being fed again. And they had done it. They had really and truly escaped. This was the first morning in nearly a decade when he could wake up without anticipating the likelihood of his own death before nightfall. The door opened, and Rhea entered, bearing a tray and 2 steaming cups of tea. Bird turned and smiled up at her. In the daylight, he could see her more clearly. She was no monster, only a woman with a cleft palate and a hesitant look in her eye, as if she expected him to turn away at the sight of her. "Good morning," he said. "I feel good this morning. It's good to be here." She sat down next to him in a graceful motion, balancing the tray as not to spill the drinks. He took his cup and cradled it in his hands. "Thanks," he said. She gave him a long, searching look, as if questioning what he was really feeling. He looked steadily into her eyes. "Well," she said at last, "you're an unusual man. You still like me in the morning." "I like you," Bird said. "You're very powerful and very beautiful." "Now you tell lies." "I wouldn't insult you by thinking I could lie to you. You'd see right through me. I've been so hungry for that. I wanted you the moment I saw you." "The first moment?" "Well, maybe not the first moment," Bird admitted. He waited, then grinned at her. "But after you put the gun down." She looked slightly confused. "That's a joke," Bird said. "Oh, never mind. Will you stay here then and be our teacher?" "I can't, Rhea. I've got to go home. I've got to find my family, if they're still alive. I've been away from them for 10 years. But will you stay for a while, until you are stronger?" "Sure." "We need a teacher here. We need a healer. You could help us." "I wish I could help you. I'll do what I can. But I've got to go home. You can understand that, can't you?" "I understand. But I lay a guise on you to come back. Or send us someone who can teach us." She put her hands on his shoulders. He felt something settle on him, like a weight. "I don't want it." He wanted to cry, but he held himself silent and opened and took it in. To carry a burden was to be alive. "I accept," he said. "If I make it home, I'll be back, or someone will." "We must work together," Rhea said. "All of us, north and south and center. We will work together and we will survive." He stayed luxuriating in rest and food and a sense of refuge. Their food was simple, but to Bird it seemed wonderful just to eat when he was hungry, to chew real vegetables and real bread instead of the slimy pastes of the prison. He and Little John spent days lying out on the beach, shaded under a muslin tarp from a harsh sun, but able to drink in its healing warmth. They were warned not to go into the water. People who did emerged with strange rashes and sometimes lost their hair. But they could watch the waves and the light dancing on its surface, and be soothed by its rhythmic sounds. Bird was tired, more tired than he wanted to admit. His mind was pushing him on toward home, but his body nestled into the sand and refused to move. After the first morning, he gave up trying to fight it. Little John had moved in with Morton. Ouch. Bird remained at Rhea's house. They lay next to each other in the long afternoon, in silence, edged with tension. By the third day, Bird began to feel energy returning. He sat up as the sun dipped into the water, laying a track of liquid gold at his feet. He wished he could walk that track to go home, and someday he would. Another day or two, I think I'll be ready to push on, he said to Little John. How about you? Little John shook his head. I'm not going with you. I'm staying here. Why? Bird asked, although he was not in his heart surprised. You never told me your name. Bird had no answers. He couldn't even honestly say he was sorry. Little John, no matter what they say, this place can't be healthy to live in. I'm telling you. You'd be welcome at my home. I'm welcome here, and I am here. I can't argue with that. It's okay, Bird. You don't owe me anything. My life, Little John shrugged. I owe you mine about 5 times over. Call it even, and quit while we're ahead, okay? I'll miss you, Bird said. You'll know where I am. Maybe you'll be back. That night, Bird was eating a late dinner with Rhea when they heard a knock on the door. When Rhea opened it, 2 men walked in. One had brown skin and sandy blonde hair, and the other was lighter of skin but with dark coiled African hair like Bird's. They both had the wiry look of those who survived on short rations, and although they seemed young, maybe in their mid-20s, their faces were deeply wrinkled like those of old men. Rhea let them in, and they came in and sit at the table with Bird, nodding hello. Rhea offered them food, but they declined. Water will do us fine if you've got it, the light-haired man said. They sat and looked Bird over closely. He looked back at them, wondering what was strange about them. Finally, he realized nothing aside from their wizened faces. They seemed completely sound. What were they doing with the monsters? They reminded him of Hi-John. Bird wondered how he was getting along, if he found his friends and the way back to the precarious safety of the hills. You're the witch from the north, the light-haired one said finally. Bird nodded. The man stuck out his hand. My name's John, Johnny Appleseed. You can call me Apple for short. This is my friend John. Johnny Cake, he said. Bird suppressed a smile and told them who he was. I think maybe I know a friend of yours, he said, a man named Hi-John. They glanced sharply at each other. Where'd you meet him? In prison, Bird told him the story. So you left him in the hills south of the dunes? 5, maybe 6 days ago. They exchanged glances. That's good to know. They fell silent while Bird finished his dinner. Rhea came back in with 4 glasses of water. The 2 men held theirs reverently for a moment, as if speaking a silent prayer. They drank slowly, then stood up. What kind of shape are you in? Apple asked. You up for a walk? Sure, Bird said. Why? We've got some things to show you, Apple said. Over the mountain. They hiked up into the hills, following snaky trails and overgrown dirt roads. Bird's leg hurt, but he told himself he didn't and almost believed it. They seemed to climb up and up endlessly. Twilight had faded to dark, but the 2 men found their way by scent and touch and starlight, with Bird stumbling behind. At last they halted below the crest of a hill, sliding on their bellies for cover. They inched their way over to the edge of the ridge and peered out. Below them, they could see the whole valley that divided the Irish Hills from the Santa Lucia in the north. As they watched, the waning moon rose, spilling silver over a grid-like pattern of lights. Vehicles moved on the roadways, and searchlights roared to train their glare on the hills. There it is, Johnny Cake said. Slow Valley. All of that's military, Apple said. Troops, weapons, transport. Take a good look. Bird looked. He didn't know how to make sense of what he saw, unless they were planning some major assault. Otherwise, why mass so many troops and so much equipment together? And what was there to assault but the north? After a few moments, he felt Johnny Cake's hand on his shoulder, urging him back. They crept down to a ravine and sheltered under a scrub oak. Probably in a stand of poison oak, Bird thought. Maybe he could learn to change his body chemistry to resist the stuff. So now you see what we're up against, Apple said. You see why we need someone like you? Who's us? Bird asked. Who are you? We're the Web, Apple said. Like the Resistance? Bird asked. You're a witch from the north. You see much of Angel City when you were down there in the pit? Just the inside of a cell block, Bird said. It's dry down there, man. Dry. Rains maybe 3 weeks out of the year. And the corporations owns all the water. Which corporation? Bird asked. Does it matter? They merged and remerged and taken each other over so many times, they're all really the same thing. They own Angel City, pretty much. Own all the farmlands, all the seeds, all the farm equipment. They own the millennialist preachers and the vid networks, Johnny Cake said. They own the steward and the government, what's left of it. And like I said, they own the water, Apple added. Charge heavy for it too, Johnny Cake said. You can tell the rich parts of town from 20 miles away. They're green. Everywhere else is brown, dead, thirsty. We've got circles there, Johnny Cake said. We've got circles everywhere, down in the valley and hidden away in the hills. And they're thirsty and sick. The stewards control the antidotes and the immunobooster drugs. Antidotes? You had an epidemic up north? Apple asked. Yeah. Some are natural, some ain't. There's plenty of people don't like the stewards. Don't believe the millennialists' bullshit, Johnny Cake said. There are plenty that would come to us and do come to us. But they die, Apple said. Without the boosters, they mostly die. That's why we need you. We need a healer. I'm not a healer, Bird said. I'm a musician, or I once was. If you're not a healer, you're the closest thing to it we've seen, Apple said. Little John told us about you, and you need us. We know you want to get back to your people. We can understand that. But think about what you've seen tonight. Where do you think that army is planning to march to? You need us, Johnny Cake repeated. You need us to be taking care of business down here. We need to work together. But why? Bird asked. Why invade us now when they left us alone for 20 years? How much do you know about the history of the Southlands in those 20 years? Apple asked. Not much, Bird admitted. You know that after the hunger that began in the drought of 25 and the collapse in 28, the Stewards' Party declared martial law and suspended elections? That was when we threw them out up north, Bird said. Well, down here it wasn't so easy. The millennialists had a huge following, and they backed the stewards. Anyway, they took power, and one of the first things they did was the expulsion of the Foreign Interests Act in 29. See, one of the main millennialist campaigns was against the Euros and the Arabs and the Asians and the other foreign investors who they thought owned too much of the country. So they passed a law confiscating the property of all those who weren't born citizens and deported a lot of them. You can imagine that didn't go too well in Panacea particularly. They nearly declared war, but they settled on a trade embargo, thinking that would bring us to our knees. It nearly did. Our economy is a wreck. We survive by scavenging parts of old machines and patching them back together. We do a lot of that too, Bird said, but we've created some new technologies in the last 20 years. We do things with crystals that are hard to believe, and we've made some great advances in wind and solar power. We haven't done shit except carry on so the rich can still believe they're rich and powerful, but even that is slowly crumbling away. We can't make new parts for computers or vid sets or anything, only cannibalize the old ones. Now we're running out. It used to be any poor asshole could afford a vid set plug into. Then it got to cost more and more. A month's pay, 2 months, 6 months. This year you can't buy one at any price. Things are desperate. So Wagner, he's the head of the Stewards' Party. He sent a diplomat to talk to the Panseans. And it seems they're willing to trade with us again if we acknowledge our debt for our confiscations. But the thing is, what do we have that they want? Like I said, we don't manufacture much. We used to export a lot of vid films and widescreens and audio discs, but since the millennialists cleaned up the industry, there's nothing much anyone would want to watch. We sell some drugs, and there's a good trade in porn, but strictly black market. But there is something Panacea wants bad, always has. What? Wood. That's where you come in the northern forests and the Golden Gate as a harbor to ship from. Never, Bird said. We give years of our lives to those trees, planting them with our own hands. We'll die before we let them be cut down and shipped away. You may do that very thing, Apple said. Think about what you saw down there. The Southlands may not be an economic power, but the stewards can still mobilize the biggest military machine left on this end of the planet. All they lack is aircraft. So you don't think they'll bomb us? They would if they could, but nobody has that level of technology anymore, and they won't need to. Easier to let a few bugs loose, pump up their army with the antidotes, move in, and mop up. Who's going to stop them? We might stop them, Johnny Cake said. An uprising down in the Southlands could stop them. That's why we need someone like you. I need to go home, Bird said. He repeated to himself like a mantra. Home, take me home. If what they said was true, and he believed it was, then more than ever he had to go back and warn the North. I need to go home, but I will come back, maybe with someone better than me at healing. I will come back, and we'll work together. You'll need our help to get home, Johnny Cake said. There's no other way around Morro Bay, and we'll help you. But don't be too long coming back, Apple said. You wait too long, it'll be too late. Rhea gave him a small pack stuffed with dried meat, cheese, and fruit, with a rolled blanket tied on. He said goodbye to her and to Little John, and then Apple and Johnny Cake put him aboard a smuggler's boat to take him up past Morro Bay. The captain was a woman who called herself Isis. Her skin was the color of blackstrap molasses. Her nails were painted silver and red. Her hair was plaited with hundreds of gold beads, and every single muscle on her body was sculpted and separately defined. Bird found her awesomely beautiful, but Rhea had warned him that she didn't like men much, and this seemed to be true. She ignored him completely once he was safely stowed aboard. The ship was a strange pistache of sails and jerry-rigged engine powered by solar panels that leaned at crazy angles off the deck and masts. But Isis guided skillfully past the old Navy radar, which worked only sporadically, and left him at the old San Simeon Pier. He walked on through the rest of the night, following the old coast road north. As daylight approached, he hid and slept. The next day he headed up into the mountain country of Big Sur. After a few hours, the coast road disappeared, long ago crumbled into the sea. He picked up his north, following old trails of streams, eating berries and the dried meat and fruit from his pack. Until his imprisonment, Bird had never thought much about his body except to appreciate its strength, its swift grace, its unending capacities for pleasure. He had never imagined that his body might be unequal to any challenge he gave it. Now pain became the constant factor, and that permeated every move, every moment of time, every sharp center point that in some odd way intensified the beauty of the rugged country. The shape of the ridges etched themselves in his arching ligaments and strained muscles. One sort of pain arose from the effort of pulling his body, groaning and sweating up long climbs, and another sort of pain was evoked by the stresses on his thighs and knees, and he tried to break his momentum on the long downhill stretches. He kept heading north. Sometimes he toiled over the outflung arms of the mountains, catching glimpses of the ocean far over the green peaks. Much of the time he followed streams and rivers, making his way from rock to rock, crossing and crisscrossing, steadying himself with his walking stick or sliding and falling, wetting his ankles and banging his knees. Walking was harder by the rivers, but often he could find no trails, and at least the streams offered him water. When the sun was hot on the ridges, he sweated water as fast as he could drink it, and the small bottle he had brought from Avalon didn't hold enough to keep him from thirst. His progress was slow, a matter of carrying on until he reached the end of endurance, then pushing on some more, 10 more steps, 20. or pausing finally, giving himself a space of 10 breaths to rest, then pushing on before he was ready, because if he waited to feel ready, he might never move again. He tried every magical trick he knew to heal, to bind the pain, to distract himself, to focus on the iridescent green of the sycamore leaves, or the slight tipsy flight of the soaring vultures. In the end, he just had to keep on, putting one foot in front of the other, pumping breath in and out of his lungs. The mountains were thickly forested. Only rarely did the trees thin out and reveal a long vista or a far-off view. Stands of giant redwoods gave way to groves of live oak, bay laurel, and madrone. In the underbrush, thickets of blackberries were interlaced with poison oak. His hands and arms bubbled and blistered and itched, but he ate the blackberries after the food in his pack gave out and carried on, stumbling on river stones and etched bruises into the feet, missing leaps he once could have easily taken, falling and pulling himself back up again, bruised and sored. He slept wrapped up in a blanket, taking shelter under the trees from the searching winds that came up from the ocean. He had lost track of how many days he'd been traveling, maybe a week, maybe more. He made his way down a river so deep that he had to wade up into his waist to cross. The cold numbed the ache in his muscles. From the left bank, an odor rose that was somehow familiar, that reminded him of something. He sniffed again. What was it? Then he looked toward the bank and saw a series of crescent-shaped pools marked off from the stream with stones. He went over and touched the water. It was warm, hot springs, he thought, and recognized the smell of sulfur. Suddenly he knew where he was. There was only one place in the interior of the mountains where the water seeped naturally up from the earth. He had been there in the good years, backpacking with Madrone and the others. Stripping off his clothes, he climbed into the pool where the water trickled into a hollow bowl of rock. The bottom of the pool was slippery with green and black algae, and he slid down, resting his head on the edge, letting in the heat soothe his legs. He closed his eyes and let the pain in his bones drift away. He rested for a long while, his body melting into the rocks and the water, until finally he opened his eyes and became aware of his surroundings. First, he noticed the springs were well maintained. The rock wall that contained the pools were freshly repaired and patched with cement. In the branches of the madrone that overlooked the pool hung offerings, bright ribbons, cloth dolls, feathers, clay images of the goddess, with big hips and breasts and bellies and round eyes, images of the god, the stag with the sun between his horns, locks of hair tied with colored shreds, stumps of wax from candles, dead flowers. He felt protected, welcomed, and he drifted into a healing trance. When he awoke, the skin on his fingertips had shriveled, and he knew it was time to get out. He climbed down and waded into the river, letting the icy shock of the cold water wake him and run through him. His body felt almost good. It occurred to him that since this place was obviously visited and used, the trail must be maintained, and he remembered it. The coast road was 12 miles away, an easy day's walk for him once, and still a distance he could cover in 2 days, if not one. And where there was a well-used trail, there would be people, friendly from the look of things, who might feed him and shelter him and help him out. Maybe he was near the end of his road.